In the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, Montana, 1882, silence carried more weight than words. It was a town where men's reputations rode in on horseback and left just as quickly, where the clinking of spurs announced arrivals before faces could be seen, and where a man's past was written in the scars on his hands and the shadows in his eyes. The stranger had been sitting in the same corner of Murphy's Saloon for 3 weeks straight. Every day, same time, same spot, same untouched whiskey glass reflecting the amber light filtering through grimy windows. He never spoke, never looked up from beneath the brim of his weathered hat, and never acknowledged the curious glances and whispered speculations that swirled around him like tumbleweeds in the desert wind. Nobody knew his name. Nobody knew where he came from. But everyone knew he was running from something or someone. Then came that Tuesday morning when everything changed. When a 7-year-old boy with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes too old for his face walked into that saloon, pointed a trembling finger at the silent stranger, and spoke words that would echo through Cedar Ridge for generations to come. This is the story of how silence was broken, how hearts were healed, and how sometimes the most unlikely souls find exactly what they've been searching for in the most unexpected places. But before we dive into the story of silence, loss, and redemption, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let us know where you're listening from. Here, every story speaks straight to the heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge's main street as Thomas, Silent Tom, McKenna pushed through the batwing doors of Murphy's Saloon. The familiar creak of hinges announced his arrival to the handful of early patrons nursing their coffee and contemplating the day ahead. Tom's boots struck the wooden floor with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the relative quiet, like a metronome counting down the hours until the town truly came alive. "Morning, stranger," called out Murphy from behind the bar, his Irish accent thick as molasses despite 20 years in Montana territory. The bartender's greeting had become a daily ritual, one that Tom acknowledged with nothing more than a slight nod before settling into his corner table. Murphy had long since stopped expecting a verbal response. Tom's appearance commanded attention without demanding it. Tall and lean, with shoulders that spoke of hard labor and harder times, he moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had learned that careless movements could mean the difference between life and death. His dark hair, streaked with premature gray at the temples, fell across his forehead, partially obscuring eyes that held depths most folks in Cedar Ridge weren't brave enough to explore. The worn leather of his gun belt creaked softly as he settled into his chair, positioning himself with a clear view of both the front and back entrances. Old habits, forged in years of looking over his shoulder, died hard. His calloused hands, scarred from rope burns and blade cuts, wrapped around the whiskey glass Murphy silently placed before him. The same ritual, the same untouched drink, the same questions burning in the eyes of everyone who watched him. "Heard tell there's been some cattle rustling up north," ventured old Pete Wilson from his perch at the bar, his weathered face creased with the kind of lines that came from squinting into prairie winds for 60-odd years. "Sheriff Thompson's been asking around, seeing if anyone's noticed anything unusual." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a dying campfire. Tom's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his glass, but his expression remained unchanged. He had perfected the art of invisibility, of being present without being seen, of existing in the spaces between other people's conversations. Murphy wiped down a glass with unnecessary vigor, his eyes darting between Tom and Pete. "Lot of drifters passing through these days," he said carefully. "Hard times make honest men do desperate things. And desperate men do things that ain't so honest," Pete replied, his gaze settling meaningfully on Tom's corner table. The saloon's atmosphere thickened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Tom could feel the weight of their speculation, their suspicion, their careful assessment of whether he represented danger or merely represented the unknown. In towns like Cedar Ridge, the difference between the two often proved academic. Through the grimy window beside his table, Tom watched the town's daily rhythm unfold. Mrs. Henderson swept the front steps of her boarding house with military precision, her gray hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her features. Across the street, young Billy Matthews loaded supplies onto his father's wagon, preparing for another day of ranch work that would leave his hands raw and his back aching. Tom had been watching these same scenes for 3 weeks now, memorizing the patterns, learning the rhythms of a town that might become his sanctuary or his trap. Cedar Ridge operated on the kind of predictable schedule that came from necessity rather than choice. In harsh country, routine meant survival, and survival meant everyone knew everyone else's business, everyone except his. The silence that had become his trademark wasn't born of choice, but of necessity. Words had weight, and in his experience, that weight could drag a man down faster than quicksand. Better to let people wonder than to give them certainty. Better to remain a question mark in their minds than to become an exclamation point in their memories. As the morning wore on, the saloon gradually filled with its usual collection of ranchers, drifters, and townspeople seeking liquid courage for the day ahead. Tom observed them all with the detached interest of a naturalist studying specimens in their habitat. There was beauty in their ordinariness, comfort in their predictability, and a kind of peace in their acceptance of life's simple rhythms. But even as he found solace in their normalcy, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that his time in Cedar Ridge was borrowed. Men like him didn't get to settle down, didn't get to become part of communities, didn't get to trade their running shoes for rocking chairs. The past had a way of catching up, no matter how far or fast you ran. The saloon door creaked open, and Sheriff Thompson stepped inside, his badge catching the light like a fallen star. Tom's hand instinctively moved closer to his gun, though he kept his expression neutral. The sheriff was a fair man, from what Tom had observed, but fairness could be a luxury law enforcement couldn't always afford. "Morning, Murphy," Thompson said, tipping his hat to the bartender. "Coffee black, if you please." As Thompson's eye swept the room, they lingered for a moment on Tom's corner table. The sheriff's expression remained professionally neutral, but Tom caught the subtle tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture. Recognition, suspicion, or simply the natural wariness of a lawman confronted with an unknown quantity. Tom met the sheriff's gaze steadily, neither challenging nor submitting, but acknowledging. A moment passed between them, a wordless exchange that spoke volumes about the delicate balance of power and respect that governed frontier towns. Then Thompson nodded slightly and turned back to his coffee, leaving Tom to wonder whether he had just passed some kind of test or failed one entirely. Tuesday morning arrived in Cedar Ridge with the kind of crisp clarity that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. Tom sat in his familiar corner, watching steam rise from his untouched coffee as the town stirred to life beyond the saloon's windows. The routine had become as natural as breathing: arrive early, observe quietly, leave when the crowd grew too thick with curiosity. But this Tuesday felt different somehow, charged with an energy Tom couldn't quite identify. The saloon doors burst open with more force than usual, accompanied by the sound of running feet and ragged breathing. Tom's hand moved instinctively toward his gun before he registered the source of the commotion. A small boy, no more than 7 years old, with tousled brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. The child stood in the doorway, chest heaving as he caught his breath, his wide eyes scanning the room with the desperate intensity of someone searching for salvation. Dirt streaked his face, and his clothes bore the unmistakable signs of someone who had been living rough, sleeping in doorways, scrounging for meals, surviving on instinct and stubborn will. "Easy there, young one," Murphy said gently, coming around the bar with a kindness that transformed his weathered features. "What's got you running like the devil himself is on your heels?" The boy didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze continued to sweep the room, passing over the handful of early patrons until it settled, with laser-like focus, on Tom's corner table. For a moment it seemed to stretch into eternity. Man and child stared at each other across the smoky interior of the saloon. Tom felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Recognition, not of the boy's face, but of something deeper. The look in those young eyes spoke of loss and loneliness, of nights spent wondering if tomorrow would bring safety or sorrow. It was a look Tom remembered wearing himself, once upon a time, in what felt like another lifetime. Then the boy did something that stunned everyone in the saloon into absolute silence. He walked directly to Tom's table, his small boots creating surprisingly confident steps across the wooden floor. Without hesitation, without fear, he pointed a trembling finger at Tom and declared in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "That's my papa now." If that moment hit you hard, just wait. What comes next will stay with you. Go ahead and like this video and share it with someone who believes in second chances. The words hit the saloon like a thunderclap. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even Murphy froze, his mouth hanging open as he processed what he had just heard. Tom stared at the boy, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time since he'd arrived in Cedar Ridge. The child's declaration hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them fully understood. "Son," Tom said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse, "I think you might have me confused with someone else." The boy shook his head firmly, tears threatening to spill from his eyes, but not quite falling. "No, sir. You're the one. Mrs. Crawford said I had to find someone to take care of me, or they'd send me away to the orphanage in Billings. She said I had to pick someone, and I pick you." Tom's throat tightened. The boy's logic was heartbreakingly simple, born of desperation and the kind of hope that only children could maintain in the face of impossible circumstances. Around them, the saloon patrons exchanged glances, their earlier suspicion of Tom momentarily overshadowed by the raw human drama unfolding before their eyes. "What's your name, boy?" asked Sheriff Thompson, who had entered the saloon just in time to witness the boy's declaration. His voice carried the gentle authority of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult situations. "Jimmy," the boy replied, not taking his eyes off Tom. "Jimmy Morrison. My ma died of the fever last month, and my pa, well, he ain't coming back." The weight of the child's words settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. Tom found himself caught between an almost overwhelming urge to flee and an equally powerful impulse to reach out and comfort the boy. The silence stretched until Murphy cleared his throat. "Mrs. Crawford's been trying to find placement for the boy," Murphy explained to Tom, though his words were clearly meant for the entire room. "His mother worked at the boarding house before she took sick. Been staying there out of charity, but Mrs. Crawford can't keep him indefinitely." Tom studied Jimmy's face, noting the stubborn set of his jaw, the way he held himself despite his obvious fear, the desperate hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in a strong wind. The boy had chosen him not because of who Tom was, but because of who Tom might become. It was a leap of faith that simultaneously humbled and terrified him. "Jimmy," Tom said carefully, his voice softer than anyone in the saloon had ever heard it. "Being someone's papa is a big responsibility. It means taking care of them, protecting them, making sure they have what they need." "I know that," Jimmy replied, his chin lifting defiantly. "And I ain't much trouble. I can work, and I don't eat much, and I already know how to take care of myself mostly." The simple dignity in the boy's words cut through Tom's defenses like a hot knife through butter. Around them, the saloon had grown so quiet that the ticking of Murphy's old clock sounded like hammer blows. Sheriff Thompson stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Tom, if that's your name, you got any experience with children?" Tom met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Some," he admitted, the single word carrying volumes of unspoken history. "The boy's got no other family," Thompson continued. "Mrs. Crawford's done what she can, but she's not equipped for permanent care. The territorial authorities will be through next month, and if Jimmy doesn't have proper guardianship by then—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. The orphanage in Billings was notorious for its harsh conditions and high mortality rates. For a boy like Jimmy, it might well be a death sentence. Tom looked down at his hands, noting how they trembled almost imperceptibly. He had spent years running from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of caring about someone enough to get hurt again. Yet here stood this small boy, offering him something he hadn't dared hope for, a chance at redemption, a reason to stop running, a purpose beyond mere survival. When he looked up, Jimmy was still watching him with those impossibly trusting eyes. "You sure about this, son?" Tom asked quietly. Jimmy nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. You got kind eyes, even when you're trying to look scary. And you don't drink your whiskey." which means you got control of yourself. Ma always said that was important in a man. The observation was so astute, so unexpectedly wise from someone so young, that Tom actually smiled. The first genuine smile anyone in Cedar Ridge had seen from him. "Well then," Tom said, standing slowly and extending his hand to the boy, "I guess we better go talk to Mrs. Crawford about making this official." Jimmy's face lit up like sunrise over the prairie, and he grasped Tom's hand with both of his own, holding on as if he never intended to let go. As they walked toward the saloon doors together, the silence that had defined Tom's stay in Cedar Ridge finally broke, replaced by something far more precious: the sound of a child's laughter and the whispered prayers of an entire community witnessing something beautiful and unexpected. The walk to Mrs. Crawford's boarding house felt like the longest journey Tom had ever undertaken, despite covering only 3 blocks of Cedar Ridge's dusty main street. Jimmy's small hand remained firmly clasped in his larger one, the child's grip tightening whenever they passed curious townspeople who stopped their morning routines to stare at the unlikely pair. Mrs. Crawford stood on her front porch, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable as she watched their approach. She was a formidable woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. As the proprietor of the town's only boarding house, she had seen her share of drifters, dreamers, and desperate souls, and her ability to judge character had kept her establishment respectable and profitable for over 2 decades. "Mr. McKenna," she said as they reached the bottom of her steps, somehow knowing his name despite his never having introduced himself. In towns like Cedar Ridge, information traveled faster than wildfire and was often just as dangerous. "Ma'am," Tom replied, removing his hat in a gesture of respect he hadn't used in years. "I understand you've been caring for Jimmy here." Mrs. Crawford's gaze shifted between the man and the boy, taking in their joined hands and the subtle change in Tom's posture, less guarded, more protective. "I have been, though my resources for such charity are limited. The boy needs proper care, a real home, someone who can provide stability." "I'd like to discuss that possibility with you," Tom said quietly, "if you'd be willing to hear me out." Mrs. Crawford studied him for a long moment, her experienced eyes cataloging details others might miss: the quality of his boots despite their worn appearance, the careful way he carried himself, the genuine concern in his voice when he spoke about Jimmy. Finally, she nodded toward the porch. "Come inside. We'll talk properly." The boarding house's front parlor reflected its owner's practical nature: clean but not elaborate, comfortable without being luxurious. Tom found himself seated across from Mrs. Crawford, while Jimmy perched nervously on the edge of a nearby chair, his eyes darting between the 2 adults who would decide his fate. "Jimmy's mother was a good woman," Mrs. Crawford began, her voice softer now, tinged with genuine affection. "Sarah Morrison worked hard, kept to herself, raised that boy with love and discipline. When the fever took her, Jimmy was devastated, but he never complained, never made demands. He's been helping with chores, earning his keep as best a 7-year-old can." Tom nodded, glancing at Jimmy, who sat straighter under the praise. "What happened to his father?" Mrs. Crawford's expression darkened slightly. "Harold Morrison was a dreamer and a gambler. Left town 2 years ago chasing rumors of gold strikes in the Dakota Territory. Said he'd send for Sarah and Jimmy once he struck it rich." She shook her head sadly. "Last letter Sarah received was over a year ago. No money, just promises and excuses." The familiar story of abandonment and broken promises hit Tom harder than he expected. He had known too many men like Harold Morrison, men who chose the illusion of easy fortune over the reality of responsibility. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Crawford," Tom said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to reveal. "I'm not a wealthy man, and my past isn't something I'm proud of, but I can provide for Jimmy, and I give you my word that he'll be safe and cared for." "Your word," Mrs. Crawford repeated, leaning back in her chair. "That's a valuable commodity in these parts, Mr. McKenna. The question is, what's it worth coming from a man who's been sitting alone in Murphy's saloon for 3 weeks, speaking to no one, revealing nothing about himself?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Tom felt Jimmy's eyes on him, sensed the boy's growing anxiety as the adult conversation took on undertones he couldn't fully understand but instinctively feared. "My name is Thomas McKenna," Tom began, each word carefully chosen. "I came to Cedar Ridge because I needed to stop running, needed to find a place where I could start over. I've made mistakes, hurt people I cared about, made choices I can't undo. But I've never harmed a child, never abandoned someone who depended on me." "What kind of work do you do?" Mrs. Crawford asked. "I know horses, cattle, ranch work. I can read and write, handle numbers. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learn quickly." Tom paused, then added quietly, "I had a son once. Lost him to scarlet fever when he was about Jimmy's age. I know what it means to care for a child, to worry about their future, to want better for them than what you had yourself." The admission seemed to surprise Mrs. Crawford, who leaned forward slightly, studying Tom's face with new interest. "And the boy's mother? Your wife? Died 6 months after our son. Grief took her as surely as the fever took him." Tom's voice remained steady, but Jimmy could see the pain that flickered across his features. "I've been running from that loss ever since, but running doesn't change what happened. It just makes you tired." Mrs. Crawford was quiet for several minutes, her fingers drumming softly against the arm of her chair. Finally, she turned to Jimmy. "What do you think about all this, young man? This is your life we're discussing." Jimmy looked at Tom with an expression far too mature for his 7 years. "I think," he said slowly, "that Mr. McKenna has been sad like me, and maybe we can be sad together until we figure out how to be happy again." The simple wisdom of the child's response seemed to settle something in the room. Mrs. Crawford's stern expression softened slightly, and Tom felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. "There would be conditions," Mrs. Crawford said finally. "The boy would continue his schooling. He'd have proper clothes, regular meals, a clean place to sleep, and I'd expect regular reports on his well-being." "Yes, ma'am," Tom agreed immediately. "All of that and more. And if Sheriff Thompson has concerns about your background, your suitability as a guardian?" Tom met her gaze steadily. "Then he should voice them. I have nothing to hide that would endanger Jimmy." Mrs. Crawford stood, smoothing her skirts with brisk efficiency. "Very well. We'll arrange a trial period, say, 2 weeks. Jimmy will stay here at night, but spend his days with you. If things work out satisfactorily, we'll discuss permanent arrangements." The compromise was more than Tom had dared hope for, and exactly what Jimmy needed: security without complete upheaval, time to adjust to the idea of a new life, without losing the familiar anchor of Mrs. Crawford's care. As they finalized the details, Tom found himself studying Jimmy's animated face, noting how the boy's entire demeanor had changed. The desperate edge was gone, replaced by something Tom hadn't seen in those young eyes before: genuine hope. Walking back through town that afternoon, Jimmy chattering excitedly about all the things they might do together, Tom realized that for the first time in 3 years, he was thinking about the future instead of running from the past. It was a terrifying and wonderful feeling, like learning to walk again after a long illness. The boy had chosen him, and in doing so, had given Tom something he had thought lost forever: a reason to believe that redemption was possible, that broken hearts could heal, and that sometimes the most important journeys began with a single, brave declaration in a dusty saloon. As they paused outside Murphy's establishment, Jimmy looked up at him with bright eyes. "What do we do now, Papa?" The word hit Tom like a physical blow, so unexpected and precious that for a moment he couldn't speak. Then he smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Now," he said, "we figure out how to build a life together." 3 months later, the corner table at Murphy's Saloon sat empty during the morning hours, a change that had taken the town of Cedar Ridge some time to adjust to. Tom McKenna's silence had been replaced by something far more remarkable: the sound of a man teaching a boy how to throw a rope properly, how to read the weather and cloud formations, how to gentle a spooked horse with patience instead of force. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first 2 weeks of Mrs. Crawford's trial period had been filled with awkward moments, tentative conversations, and the delicate dance of 2 wounded souls learning to trust each other. Jimmy had tested boundaries with the careful precision of a child, who had learned not to expect too much from adults. While Tom had struggled with the rusty machinery of nurturing, his protective instincts warring with his fear of failing another child. "Papa, you're doing it wrong," Jimmy said on this particular October morning, his young voice carrying across the small corral behind Henderson's livery stable, where Tom had secured part-time work breaking horses. The boy sat perched on the fence rail, his legs swinging freely as he watched Tom work with the particularly stubborn mare. Tom paused in his efforts, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. "Oh, am I now? And I suppose you've got a better way." Jimmy grinned, the expression lighting up his entire face. "Ma always said you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Maybe you should try talking sweeter to her." The casual mention of his mother no longer brought the shadow of grief to Jimmy's features that it once had. Time and Tom's gentle encouragement had helped the boy process his loss, transforming sharp pain into softer remembrance. "Talking sweeter, huh?" Tom approached the fence where Jimmy sat, noting how the boy had grown in the past months, not just physically, though Mrs. Crawford's cooking had filled out his previously gaunt frame, but in confidence, in security, in the simple knowledge that he was wanted and protected. "Watch this," Jimmy said, hopping down from the fence with the fluid grace that only children possessed. He approached the mare slowly, his small hand extended, speaking in the kind of nonsensical, affectionate babble that seemed to calm animals instinctively. To Tom's amazement, the horse that had been fighting him for the better part of an hour immediately settled, allowing Jimmy to stroke her neck without resistance. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom muttered, then quickly added, "Don't repeat that word." "Yes, sir," Jimmy replied with mock solemnity, though his eyes sparkled with mischief. "Mrs. Crawford says ladies don't appreciate rough language, and if I want to court one someday, I better learn proper manners now." Tom chuckled, a sound that had become increasingly common over the past months. "Mrs. Crawford's been teaching you about courting, has she?" "Some," Jimmy admitted, "but mostly she just tells me stories about you when you were young." This was news to Tom. "Stories about me?" Jimmy nodded eagerly. "She says you used to be married to a lady named Elizabeth who made the best apple pie in 3 counties, and that you had a little boy named Samuel who looked just like you, but with his mama's gentle nature." Tom's breath caught in his throat. He had never told Mrs. Crawford about Elizabeth or Samuel, had barely mentioned their existence to anyone in Cedar Ridge. The fact that she somehow knew, that she had been sharing those precious memories with Jimmy, left him speechless. "She says," Jimmy continued, seemingly unaware of the emotional impact of his words, "that losing them nearly broke your heart permanent-like, but that God has a way of bringing people together when they need each other most." The simple faith in the boy's voice, his acceptance of loss and hope in equal measure, reminded Tom why he had fallen in love with being a father the first time around. Children possessed a resilience that adults spent lifetimes trying to reclaim. "Mrs. Crawford's a wise woman," Tom said quietly. "She is," Jimmy agreed. "She also says you're the best thing that happened to me since Ma got sick, and that I'm probably the best thing that happened to you since, well, since forever." Tom knelt down, so he was at eye level with the boy, studying the face that had become as familiar and precious to him as breathing. "What do you think about that?" Jimmy considered the question with the seriousness he brought to all important matters. "I think," he said finally, "that maybe families don't always start the regular way. Maybe sometimes they start when people choose each other instead of just being born together." The wisdom of it, the simple truth that cut through all of Tom's complicated feelings about worthiness and redemption and second chances, nearly brought tears to his eyes. This child, who had lost everything and still possessed the courage to love again, had taught him more about healing than 3 years of running ever could. "I think you're right," Tom said, reaching out to ruffle Jimmy's hair. "I think that's exactly how the best families start." As they walked back toward town for lunch, Jimmy chattering about the school lessons he was excited to share and the new book Mrs. Crawford had promised to read with him, Tom reflected on the changes that had transformed not just his own life, but the way Cedar Ridge saw him. The suspicious glances had gradually given way to respectful nods. Shopkeepers who had once watched him carefully now included him in casual conversation. Sheriff Thompson had even asked his opinion on a horse theft case, recognizing expertise that Tom hadn't realized he'd been displaying. But the most significant change was internal. The man who had spent 3 weeks sitting in silence, nursing untouched whiskey, and avoiding human connection, had been replaced by someone who woke each morning with purpose, who planned for tomorrow instead of hiding from yesterday, who had learned that love didn't always end in loss. "Papa," Jimmy said as they reached the boarding house steps, "do you think Ma would like you?" The question caught Tom off guard, not because it was painful, but because he realized he could answer it honestly, without the crushing weight of grief that had once made any mention of the past unbearable. "I think," Tom said carefully, "that any mother who raised a boy as good and brave as you would understand that sometimes the best gift you can give someone is a second chance to be happy." Jimmy nodded sagely, accepting this wisdom with the same grace he brought to all of life's complexities. "That's what I think too." As they joined Mrs. Crawford for lunch, Tom caught her knowing smile and realized that the entire town of Cedar Ridge had been complicit in his healing, creating a community that made space for broken people to rebuild themselves. The silence that had once defined him had given way to something far more powerful. The sound of laughter at the dinner table, bedtime stories read by lamplight, and quiet conversations about dreams and hopes and the kind of future that was built one day at a time. That evening, as Tom tucked Jimmy into bed in the small room they had made their own above Henderson's livery, the boy looked up at him with sleepy contentment. "Papa," he said drowsily, "I'm glad I picked you that day in the saloon." Tom smoothed the covers around the boy's small form, his heart full of gratitude for the courage of a 7-year-old who had seen something in a broken man that the man hadn't been able to see in himself. "I'm glad you did too, son," he replied softly. "I'm glad you did too." Did this story move you? Leave a little heart in the comments and tell us. Do you believe that family is something we choose? Outside, the wind whispered through the streets of Cedar Ridge, carrying with it the promise of winter and the comfort of home. And in a small room above a livery stable, a former drifter and an orphaned boy slept peacefully, dreaming of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow, secure in the knowledge that some families are born not of blood, but of choice, courage, and the simple human need to love and be loved in return. In the morning, Tom would return to his work with the horses, Jimmy would attend his lessons with Mrs. Patterson, and life would continue in its gentle, predictable rhythm. But the corner table at Murphy's Saloon would remain empty, a silent testament to the power of a child's faith and the possibility of redemption in the most unlikely places. The boy had pointed at the silent cowboy and claimed him as family. No one had argued then, and no one ever would, because everyone in Cedar Ridge had witnessed something rare and beautiful. The moment when two broken hearts found each other and discovered that healing was not only possible, but inevitable, when you had the right person to heal alongside. Here on this channel, we tell stories like this, real, emotional, transformative. If you want more, turn on the bell and come along with us.